I'm Susie Miller, and I'm an e-learning accessibility consultant and the founder and director of Ella Hub. I'm also the author of a book called Designing Accessible Learning Content. And with me today, I have Esi Hardy, who contributed an amazing learner case study to the book. And I'll pass over to Esi now to introduce herself properly.
Hello, I'm Esi Hardy. I'm founder, owner and managing director of Celebrating Disability, a disability inclusion business. And I'm also owner and founder of the Disability Inclusion Community, which is an online platform for businesses that would like to be inclusive of disabled people.
Great, thanks, Esi. So today we have two questions which we're going to try and answer. And the first one that we're going to look at is, why is it so important to make learning content accessible? So Esi, perhaps you could start and tell us in your own words why you think it's so important that all learning content should be made accessible for people with disabilities.
So I think there's many reasons actually, and I'm going to try and go through the main ones. So the one I want to begin with, and one of the most important ones for me is autonomy. And so I am a disabled person, and I was a disabled child. Therefore, I was disabled when I was at school, college, and university. And until very recently, when I was at school and studying and everything was paper-based and book-based. And for me, that meant I needed a lot of support. So when I was young, I had what's called an amanuensis to sit next to me and to write for me, and essentially to write what I dictated to them. So in the very early years of kind of being at school, obviously you're learning to do things like construct a sentence. And so, but what would happen was the teacher would try to be making my life easier. And for all the best intentions, she would say to me, Esi, you don't need to worry about the sentence construction. All you need to worry about is the answer. Because she felt that the most important thing was that I knew what I was talking about. So, for example, the question might be, what is your name? And so the children would answer, my name is ... and then obviously the dots would fill in the gaps of their name. And then the teacher would say, Esi, all you need to do is say your name. So my answer would be Esi. And so I never learned how to construct a sentence until I was a lot older, because I never had to. And the other thing was about note-taking. So when you are taking your own notes, you write notes that spark off because you don't write the whole sentence of everything. You write the little notes, the little buzzwords that spark your memory off to remind you what you learned. And that's very individual and unique to every single person. But because somebody was writing it for me, they were writing from their unique point of view. So I was never having those notes to spark my memory, because they weren't my memory. And I couldn't really say in a class, please write that, because we were watching a video or somebody was talking or something. And since there's been digital ways of learning, e-learning, it's meant that I've been able to take more control over that. And I'm a very visual learner, so I learn by seeing and I learn by doing. And obviously when I was younger and doing things in class, like I just explained, I wasn't doing, I was just listening. And so things didn't sink in as much.
Really interesting.
The second point I want to make is that I think that every learner deserves, disabled people and every single learner deserves equal rights to learning opportunities and education and knowledge. There's a reason why the saying knowledge is power is still a really kind of prevalent saying. It's because it's true. No matter how you learn or no matter what you learn, the more knowledge you have, the more you're able to do with your life. And disabled people for many decades have been put at a disadvantage because of the physical barriers created by people not knowing how to support disabled people in the right way. And not all, but a lot of those barriers have been mitigated by e-learning practices. So it means that disabled people have much more opportunities to access that knowledge and that learning environment. That means that we as disabled people can move forward and do what we want to do with our lives.
Brilliant.
The third point I want to make is that as disabled people, we encounter barriers all the time. And these barriers stop us from accessing our daily lives. But again, if we use this knowledge that we can gain by learning digitally, it means that the world is more open to us. And not only can we do what we want to do in our lives, we can mitigate those barriers for other disabled people, because we're learning business processes and lots of ways to do that, and learning from past experiences of other disabled people as well.
Definitely.
And I think, maybe one of the most, if not the most important thing is, to remember that the digital access is not a privilege, or it should not be a privilege. It should be a right to every single individual. It's not, you're so lucky, Esi, you've been able to access this. It should be, well, of course, Esi, you're able to access this. Do you want to? So, I mean, in my lifetime, up until now, it has been a privilege if I have been able to do an online course or to do a course, because the college or the university has created these adaptations for me. But I would love for it to be in the future that the parents of disabled children, rather than thinking, oh my gosh, what school should we send our child to? Because where will they be included? Where will the teachers, where will the equipment be set up for them to be able to learn in the same way as everybody else? And they, into a place where they think, well, that's just natural. Of course, when we go here, all the equipment, all the technology will be here already. And all they're thinking of, well, where's the best catchment area? Is it close enough to my work? Where do I actually want to live? And everything else that non-disabled people think about. So yes.
Definitely. Thank you, Esi. That's such a fantastic answer. And it's so great to have the learning perspective of someone who has a lived experience of disability. And it reminds me of something very powerful that you said in the case study, which you contributed. And it was something along the lines of that we must have equal rights to access learning, so that we can move on in life instead of being forced into situations which perpetuate the stereotype that disabled people aren't able to achieve. And that really struck a chord for me when I read that. And as a learning designer, it really enforced the idea that designing content which is accessible and doesn't unnecessarily exclude anyone is just simply the right thing to do. So I think there also, it's really interesting, again, coming back, as a perspective as a learning designer, that there are so many other benefits to making learning content accessible. And I think those get overlooked as well. So in my experience as an e-learning consultant, and also as an instructional designer, I think, I always think that accessible learning, I do quite a lot of work looking at people's examples. I do audits and overviews of accessibility. And in the examples I see, accessible content is just consistently better content. And I think for me, that is because of this idea of empathy, that someone who has created a piece of learning that's accessible has actually been considering the needs of their learners a lot more. And so they really think about it. And that really comes across in the fact that it just tends to be so much better learning if someone has made it accessible, because this idea that they've just included everybody and thought about everybody's experience. So that's a real positive for me. And I also think that this idea of accommodating people who have, so we're talking about permanent impairments, but this idea that it also accommodates any learners that have situational or temporary impairments. So we talked before, I think, about the idea that if you put captions on a video, that benefits not only people with hearing impairments, but also someone who is watching a training video on their commute to work, and maybe they haven't got their headphones with them. So that could be a real advantage for them. And also the same of a temporary impairment, someone maybe who's broken their wrist and they might not be able to use a mouse. They have to then start navigating using a keyboard. So there's a whole array of things that we do to make learning accessible for people who have permanent disabilities that actually benefit the wider audience. So that's a real key one for me. And I think there's also wider ones as well. So when we look at the case for accessible learning, there are things like the idea that if you make it accessible, you're avoiding the risk of the legal risk of a lack of accessibility. You're also serving a rapidly growing aging population. So in effect, you're making your your learning future-proof. And also a really important one, I think, is this idea that you're legitimizing your organization's commitment to diversity and inclusion, because if your products aren't accessible, then you're certainly not. So it's kind of like you're actually, you know, in a way, you're like I said, you're legitimizing that commitment to diversity and inclusion. And the final one, I think, is one that, again, I think it's only just beginning to surface, is this idea that it's so important for learning and development as a business boost, really, to think that if you actually live your accessibility credentials, then it has the power to deliver profits and market share. So quite a lot of the industry leaders that I interviewed for designing accessible learning content actually confirmed that accessibility had a significant impact on their sales strategy, and that in turn had enabled them to extend their market reach. So I think for all of these reasons, I really do believe that more and more people are beginning to realize just how important it is to make learning content accessible. And I genuinely believe that the tide is turning against non-accessible learning content in learning and development. So anything that you wanted to add to that, Esi, or any kind of final takeaways for that question?
Well, I think you just summed that up really, really well. And I think, you know, as you were saying, with kind of the business case and helping with that sales strategy, if disabled people or anybody really with different learning needs sees what that training provider is doing to include them, to engage and welcome them in, then they're more likely to go with that training provider than a training provider that's not showing how inclusive they're making an effort to be.
Fantastic. So let's move on now to our second question, which is looking in more detail about how, as e-learning professionals, we can actually make our learning content accessible. And again, we're really privileged to have Esi's lived experience as a learner to help us. So Esi, I wonder if you could help us answer the next question, and that is, how can e-learning professionals make their learning content accessible for people with motor impairments?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to talk about this again from my own personal lived experience. So I have cerebral palsy, and caused by my cerebral palsy, I have very limited dexterity in my hands. So what that means for me is that although I can use the keyboard and I use a trackpad, but I can also use a mouse, I use them very slowly and a bit haphazardly, to be fair. The more I am trying to do something at speed, or the more I feel under pressure, the less control I have over my over the things I do on the computer, and the longer it takes me as well. So I'm going to go into that a bit more in detail in a minute, but I think that it's really important to note that quite a few e-learning platforms, especially kind of institutions that have e-learning platforms, they ask disabled people, and they've asked me in the past about my access requirements. And I've given my access requirements at the beginning of the module. So in order to know what an access requirement that you need is, you have to know what you're going to be doing, or else it would just be an open question, like how long is a piece of string? So what I tend to do is try and look at the module material, and also try and talk to the course tutors to give me some advice as to what is going to be happening and how it's going to be happening. But because you can't actually fit a year's worth of material in an introduction, they don't cover everything. And also, not everybody remembers every single part, and not everybody knows your entire access requirements, which is why it's a joint decision. So what I found in the past is that I thought, okay, brilliant. Now I know what I'm going to have to do. These are the things I need. These are the support requirements that I need in order to access where I'm doing. But what happens is that halfway through, I get to this section and I think, oh, I didn't know that was coming. I need a bit more support. But because the support is already in place, some institutions don't like to retroactively fit access requirements. Okay. And that's what I've found has happened to me in the past. So I've been set up at the beginning thinking that I've got the stuff I need, and then halfway through realized that actually there's quite a lot missing because I didn't know what was coming. So my advice from that point would be to allow for retroactive access requirements to be fitted, so that when somebody hits a bit in the middle of their module, or their disability fluctuates or changes, they can actually come back to the institution and say, well, I didn't realize this before, or this wasn't the case before, but now I need this level of support. So actually being a bit flexible and a bit agile to the fact that disability isn't always going to be the same. And the more information you can give a disabled person about what they will need to do, the more equipped that disabled person will be to have that conversation about what support they may need. So there is I mean, like I said before, there's lots of technology that's enabled me to study independently. And so, for example, I use Apple for everything. I mean, obviously other providers are available. I use Apple for everything. And one of the reasons why I think Apple is so good is because it's got a lot of inbuilt accessibility technology in it already. And one thing that I find is really good is Siri. So I can actually speak to Siri and dictate to Siri what I would like to write. And also Siri can also speak back to me. So although I'm not blind, or I don't have a sight impairment, it's really helpful for me to listen back to what listen to what I'm reading rather than physically read it, so I can take it all in. I can pause it at certain points to make notes, and also I can speed up or slow down the speech to my liking, so that's really, really helpful as well. It's really important to me for the keyboard to be really accessible as well, so that I can tab through, for example. So, for example, if you take something simple like a multiple choice questionnaire, and it might seem to a non-disabled person that doesn't have difficulties with fine motor movements, that actually clicking a button is quite easy. But actually, for somebody who does struggle with fine motor movements, those clickings of the buttons can actually be really tricky. So providing the ability for somebody to tab through the page, the web page, and then tab through those options with their keyboard allows people to access it the way that they want to and the way that they need to as well. And actually, with that in mind, the time-sensitive way of, the time-sensitive you have to do this in the next 10 minutes is really, really difficult. So as I said right at the beginning, that the more tense I get, the more tension that I have on me, the harder it is for me to control both the keypad and the keyboard. So taking away that time restriction is really, really helpful for disabled people, and not just from a physical point of view actually, but from lots of different points of view, including mental health impairments. Actually not putting that pressure on somebody when it actually really doesn't need to be there is really, really helpful.
Definitely.
And also, just the other thing I wanted to add is, and this is something I've found since I've had to do more independent learning as I've continued on my degree, is that actually a lot of information contained in university libraries and institution libraries is on PDF. And obviously, there's several reasons why people use PDF. One of those reasons is that you can store more information and use less bandwidth. But what it also means is that screen readers can't read PDF. So what I tend to do when I use a screen reader, or when I select text with Siri and get it to read to me, is that I might select a paragraph, for example, so that I'm not reading a whole article all at once without a break and without being able to take it in, but I'm breaking it down into paragraphs so that then I can take some notes or even have a break and have a drink and go to the loo. But in a PDF, if at all, because quite often it's not even possible at all, you can't break down the text and read them as chunks. And as I said, sometimes you can't read the text at all. And what I've also found recently is lots of kind of articles from the 80s have been kind of transcribed and put on the computer. So I think, maybe photocopied or something.
Okay.
So sometimes you have it, so the words are split between two lines. And screen readers aren't very good at recognizing that that's the same word.
Okay.
So you have to really concentrate. And as somebody who can see and read the word, I can kind of read along and make it out. But it does make me wonder if somebody with a sight impairment or that's blind is listening, whether that sentence would actually make any sense at all. So those are just some really quick things that I think should be considered. Do you have anything to add?
Well, it's really interesting because again, it's the other, looking at it from the other perspective. So looking at it as as someone who's actually designing the content. So I completely agree with you what you were saying about PDF content. I think some PDFs, you can make them accessible, but again, I think for many people that's something that it's a new skill that they need to learn. And when you're looking at a lot of content that's held like legacy content, I think that's a huge issue. And I think the universities and higher education is certainly something that they're aware of and that they are trying to address. But I think it's, when you hear your experiences, and again, it's coming back to the lived experience of the frustration that it causes you, it really brings it home just how important it is that those kind of issues are addressed. And really interesting when you were talking about the keyboard accessibility. So again, I suppose it comes back to when you are creating and developing learning content, it's this idea that actually you need to understand how someone who's using assistive technology is working, and the things that you need to do as a learning designer using the tools. You need to know how to use your tool that you're creating the content to make it accessible. So a really interesting thing when you were talking about keyboard accessibility is this idea that it's your responsibility as a learning designer to know how to use your tool to make sure that actually what we call the reading order, so the order in which you're going through the content, that a screen reader, for example, or a keyboard user is going through that content is in a linear and logical order. You can imagine how frustrating it would be if someone is using a screen reader and they're jumping from the links or anything interactive, and that's jumping all over the place instead of going in a logical linear order. So it's kind of coming back to this idea that it's the responsibility of the learning designer to find out how their tool, how to use their tool to make that work for someone. And with some tools, it can be as simple as you just put, your blocks of content in that order, and that will be the reading order. In other learning tools, you'll have to, or authoring tools, you'll have to go in and actually manually find out how to do that. You'll have to change the reading order, or sometimes you call that the tab order. So it's this idea really of, if you need to make your content accessible, you need to know how to use your tool to make it accessible. And another really interesting point about that tab order is that in some tools you have the ability to have, one of the things that you should have is what we call a visible focus indicator. So it should be clear for someone who is a keyboard user who is jumping from one interactive item to the next, which interactive item has the focus, because that's obviously how you know where you are on the page. And also it's how you know something's focused so that you can actually activate it. And in some authoring tools, and the majority of authoring tools, that is, you are able to, that's kind of automatically is part of the functionality of the tool. But in some tools, you also have the ability to go in and change maybe the color or the weight of that. So, and that then makes it easier for someone, depending what maybe the colors that you've chosen for your the actual learning content, sometimes that focus indicator can be really difficult for people to see. So again, it's really this idea of the responsibility of the content designer to actually going in and understanding how to use their tool to make something accessible. So another thing that struck me when you were talking about the timing actually is again, a lot of authoring tools allow you to control whether you have a time limit imposed on your quizzes, for example. But one thing for me that's really important that people sometimes overlook is the idea that you have a consistent and clear navigation. And that again for me is kind of like a timing issue. It's saving someone time and saving them frustration. You know, if you've got a very clear and it's always consistent, they know where to find things, that really prevents them having that, you know, that time constraint of spending so much longer having to actually navigate through content, because they're constantly looking for things, because the you know, things are changing and they're not consistent throughout the learning module. So I think we often think of that as being important for people with cognitive impairments, but it's just as important for someone who is navigating using the keyboard. And it again comes back to this issue of that it can take a lot longer for someone to actually navigate content using the keyboard than it can do with a mouse. So again, it's that idea of just, you know, really being mindful of the different ways that people access content. And a final thing I think for me is just a recommendation that I always make is to be really careful of the language that you're using, so to make sure it's inclusive. So in a lot of learning content, you will still see, you know, click here or tap here if it's mobile content, and that just assumes that everyone is accessing that content in the same way. So we always recommend that if you use the word select, then that includes everybody. You know, it's not assuming that everybody is using a mouse or maybe their finger to tap to access the content. So it's a really small thing, but actually I think it has a huge impact. So I think that's everything for me. Is there anything from there that you wanted to pick out, or any final kind of key takeaways that you wanted to make to give people to take away?
I think that you're so correct with everything you say, and I you know, I really like the way you summed up. You know, it's the kind of the provider's responsibility, and I think just from, you know, just echoing what you said about kind of knowing your own tools, and I think if you, we've talked a lot today about kind of the value of lived experience, and I completely, you know, I agree that the you know, there's no limit to the value of lived experience. But as a provider, providers can experience that themselves and think, oh God, that was really difficult. How can I make that simpler?
True. Yeah.
And just literally highlighting a section of their website and getting it to read back to them, to hear what it sounds like, to hear where those punctuations or those extra punctuations need to be, in order for that to make sense to the person that's using that screen reader. Just little things. I think you're so correct with that. Obviously, I think you're correct with everything you're saying. But, and I think, you know, you're really, you know, your point about kind of using the term select is really inclusive, absolutely. But it also reminds those providers and the people that are designing those to do it. To make it selectable. So if you're writing it, you think, oh yeah, no, I need to do that. And so it's another kind of memory jog. And just, I suppose, to add to what you were saying as well, is that what you are trying to get to with e-learning, accessible e-learning platforms, is equity for the user. So the user has fair access that makes their experience equal to a user that doesn't need accessible e-learning tools. And if you think about how fast, how quick an activity is for a non-disabled learner, how can you make that activity less arduous for that disabled learner, so they can have fairer access to actually learn what they're learning without having to work out how they're going to get to the material in the first place?
Yes, great point. Okay, that's wonderful. So thank you so much again, Esi. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege speaking to you today and getting your amazing feedback and your amazing perspective on what we're talking about. So thank you so much for your input.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay.